Welcome to a history of the Soviet-Afghanistan War, a brutal conflict fought in one of the world's most contested regions, Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a large mountainous region that lays on the Silk Road between Europe and Asia. Because of this, it has often been the sturdy plaything of empires, such as the ancient Persians, the Mongol Empire. It was subject to the Great Game in the early 19th century, and more recently, the Soviet Union and the United States of America. Each of these conquests have extensive and interesting histories, but today we delve into that of the 9-year Soviet excursion into the region. After the death of his father in 1933, Mohammad Zahir Shah, 19, became the last king of Afghanistan. His 40-year reign would mark a growth in Afghanistan, growing its economy and civil liberties. This is primarily because the Shah didn't really run his country. Instead of practicing his power, he left it to his paternal uncles to act as prime minister for the first 30 years in office. Even when Zahir began his political career, he was constantly aided by foreign advisors and was aided multiple times financially by both the US and USSR. In 1973, Muhammad was vacationing in Italy when his cousin Muhammad Daoud Khan led a bloodless coup to install a democratic government. Muhammad Daoud Khan was not complacent towards the Shah's rule and lack of political motivation. So, while the Shah was out of the country in Italy, Daoud forced the Shah to abdicate. Daoud was backed by the military, creating no physical resistance towards the coup. Daoud brought in a new constitution that brought in democratic reforms and socialistic policies. Daoud was the only leader of the Afghanistan Republic at the time, and his unorthodox ideology made him a lot of enemies. Daoud, while sympathetic to socialist values and the Soviet Union, did not want communists interfering with his government, and began to purge leftists from his party. It should be noted that Daoud's democracy was a one-party system, so these purges isolated many from being able to effectively participate in politics at all. Daoud was also very much in favor of higher governmental authority, which was not liked by the liberals in his party. Daoud's efforts at Pashtunization, or the practice of assimilating the peoples of Afghanistan and Pakistan to the Pashtun peoples, were heavily disliked and opposed by minority groups in Afghanistan. I mean, wow, all these groups that oppose Khan. If you think something's going to happen here, well, you'd be right. In 1978, after communist unification resulting from the assassination of Mir Akbar Khyber, Daoud Khan demanded the arrest of prominent communist leaders. Hold on. Before we delve into the next section, I'd like to tell you that there were two main factions of the Afghanistan Communist Party, Parcham and Kauk. Parcham believes Afghanistan doesn't have the proper Marxist material conditions sufficient for a socialist revolution and therefore advocates slow socialist reform within government. Kauk, on the other hand, believes in Leninist material conditions and believes that Afghanistan mimics the conditions of the early Soviet Union and was therefore open to communist revolution. Okay, please continue. What happened, however, is that the Afghanistan police force believed the Parcham faction was much more dangerous, and therefore focused more on Parcham. What the police didn't know was that Kauk was actually much more of a threat, as they had almost 3 times the military strength as the Parcham faction. In the week prior to April 26, while on house arrest, Hafizullah Amin, the leader of the Kauk faction, sent the orders to prepare and launch a coup against the government. Kauk military cells began to mobilize in Kabul, Afghanistan's capital, and within 3 days the Kauk had fought their way into the imperial palace of Muhammad Daoud Khan, who was killed after refusing to pledge allegiance and charged Kauk soldiers with a pistol. After what is now known as the Sour Revolution, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, or PDPA, established a socialist government with party members from both the moderate Parcham and the revolutionary Kauk faction. The new government outlawed predatory loan practices, which were prolific in the rural countryside. The PDPA brought in sweeping land reforms, redistributing the land of petty bourgeois farm owners. However, this program was not without its faults. Due to the rapid nature of this legislation, many were given land without the knowledge of how to use it. So, for a short time, Afghanistan's food production was drastically reduced. The PDPA also formally established an equality of the sexes, a stark contrast to Afghanistan's previous governments. Anahita Ratsabed wrote this in the 1978 New Kabul Times. Privileges women, by right, must have are equal education, job security, health services, and free time to rear a healthy generation for building the future of the country. Educating and enlightening women is now the subject of close government attention. The government was headed by Nur Muhammad Turaki, a Caucasist who ruled for under a year. During his tenure, he had Hafizullah Amin develop a cult of personality around Turaki for propaganda purposes. Hafizullah regretted this, as Turaki soon began to believe the propaganda put forward by Amin. As Turaki took power, divisions between the Kauk and the Parcham faction began to show, with each side declaring each other guilty of conspiring against the government. Turaki began to politically purge members of the Parcham faction by making them permanent ambassadors for other countries. Not only did this seed the roots of distrust in the Parcham faction, but the move was also unpopular among the Kauk, with many believing Turaki had become too overconfident in himself. Actively disuniting the party in this fragile time was not a smart move. Tensions were not limited to Turaki and the Parcham. Hafizullah Amin grew more and more uncomfortable with Turaki's belief in his own brilliance, and these tensions grew to a head when Turaki made Amin his successor in every possible way, effectively checkmating Amin into giving up his hold on the military. Shortly afterwards, Amin and his inner cabinet received a false report stating that Amin was planning to kill Turaki. Aziz Akbari was then given the job to assassinate Amin. Aziz was never told of the top-secret nature of this plan, which he then shared with the Soviet embassy, confident they were in on it. The Soviet embassy promptly relayed this information to Amin, which is believed to have saved his life. I mean, wow. You would really think that an assassination mission is by nature top secret, but I guess it really takes a special kind of stupid, eh? On the 11th of September, 1979, Turaki, to his surprise, was met by Amin at the Kabul airport after a return flight from Moscow. Turaki tried but failed in dismissing Amin from all of Amin's governmental positions. Amin and the chief of police, along with an intelligence officer, later visited the imperial palace upon request of the Soviet embassy, but upon entering was immediately fired upon by guards. The chief of police was immediately killed, but Amin managed to run out back to his car, where he drove to the Ministry of Defense to place the army on high alert and send the 4th Armored Division to surround the imperial palace. Amin then entered the imperial palace with a group of army officers and placed Turaki under arrest. Nur Muhammad Turaki was later secretly suffocated with pillows and buried. The public was never notified, instead saying Turaki was a victim of a serious illness. The killing gave Leonid Brezhnev good cause to invade Afghanistan 2 months later, as he had vowed to protect Turaki. If you think Turaki's rule was short, under a year, look no further to Hafizullah Amin, who was in office a whole 3 months. The Soviets already disliked Amin for killing Turaki, and then Amin began his reign immediately with purging of supposed reactionaries within Afghanistan, an action disliked by the Soviets, and then Amin declared in a speech that he is seeking to further Afghanistan's relations with China and remove Soviet meddling within the country. This was also, unsurprisingly, disliked by the Soviets. This was all aided by the fact that due to the political situation in Afghanistan, insurgents were literally everywhere. The PDPA was falling apart at the seams, bourgeois farmers were unhappy with recent agricultural policy, and Islamic groups were radically opposed to the socialist atheist government. So, the Soviet Union invoked a previously signed Friendship Treaty, which allowed the Soviets to act militarily in the interest of the Afghani peoples. If the Soviet-Afghanistan War was a song, Operation Storm 333 is the prelude. Taking place on the 27th of December, 1979, a total of 660 soldiers belonging to Spetsnaz, KGB, and Russian airborne forces surrounded and breached the Tajbeg Palace, where Hafizullah Amin and 2,200 soldiers resided. Many Afghani soldiers laid down their arms in the realization that they were being attacked by Soviet forces and not Afghani ones. For those who still fought, it was not long before they would succumb to the swiftness of Soviet special forces, with the whole battle lasting only 40 minutes, resulting in 350 Afghan deaths and a mere 14 Soviet. Hafizullah refused to believe the Soviets were attacking the palace. Upon a direct report from his adjutant stating that the Soviets were attacking the palace, Amin claimed that this was a lie. This was a position that he held until Soviet forces breached his room, held a trial, and executed Hafizullah Amin. Hafizullah's 11-year-old son was killed by shrapnel during the fighting. 1,700 soldiers were captured, and the Soviets promptly burned Tajbeg Palace after the skirmish. Up until now, I have only really been focusing on the major political events on the center stage for Afghanistan. But since the kingdom of Mohammad Zahir Shah, there has been growing chaos in the country of Afghanistan. As it is not just the parties, monarchs, and oligarchs that have opinions. Many groups of disenfranchised, unhappy citizens have been organizing against, actively revolting against, and have been trying to disrupt the PDPA government over issues such as land reform, religion and government, and most prominently during Taraki and Amin's rule, the purging of civilian population over suspected reactionary activity. This chaos was born out of political instability. This is what gave the Soviets proper cause to wage war. So when you hear the term Soviet-Afghanistan War, it is not the Soviets waging war against the government of Afghanistan or the people of Afghanistan, but in fact the Mujahideen. But who exactly are the Mujahideen? Well, that's a very tricky question, because the Mujahideen is really just Islamic rebels both inside and outside of Afghanistan. In fact, this is a large reason why the Soviet war in Afghanistan is often compared to the Vietnam War. The enemy is both large and small, everywhere and nowhere at all. A Soviet combatant entering a village could expect anywhere between no Mujahideen soldiers in the town to every civilian in the town a soldier. And once the war started, the Mujahideen were not just any old rebel group. No, they were funded by many outside parties such as China, the United States, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. But these groups only made up 25% of Mujahideen funding. The rest was donated by third-party churches and organizations throughout the Islamic world. A notable example of third-party funding was the sending of a large volunteer force made up by Arabian Muslims, led by Osama bin Laden. Yeah, that Osama bin Laden. The Mujahideen received almost $2.5 billion in funding and equipment per year in modern US dollars alone from the United States of America. It is falsely believed that the US missile launchers are what aided the Mujahideen victory the most, when in reality this just forced the Soviets to switch to more frequent night raids, rendering the launchers useless. Foreign equipment wasn't just used to fight the Soviets, but sadly citizens as well. Many civilians opposed to Mujahideen occupation of a town were killed for their resistance and as a show of power to other civilians. On the 27th of December, 1979, 80,000 Soviet soldiers entered Afghanistan, immediately holding key cities and infrastructure of strategic importance, such as military bases, airfields, and airports. All of these locations were linked through two grand routes that formed a pincer and eventually a hollow crescent, stabbing into Afghanistan and meeting in the city of Kandahar. These ground routes were supplemented by an air corridor into Kabul. This first stage of occupation lasted a year and marked the first battles between Soviet and Mujahideen forces. Soviet forces initially almost always succeeded in open-air battles, using advanced artillery and air power to their advantage. This drew rebels to fight in urban environments where they had more success. After a successful period of occupation, the Soviets would initiate a period of offensives from 1980 to 1985, where Soviet divisions would implement a search and destroy strategy to eliminate the Mujahideen. This strategy was marked by three tenets: intimidation, where helicopters and bombers would punch into Mujahideen territory to destroy villages that housed insurgents, effectively creating death zones that would make it impossible to live without fleeing, which would prevent civilian support for the Mujahideen. Subterfuge, another aspect of search and destroy warfare, was the heavy use of KHAD or COD, Afghanistan's intelligence service, to infiltrate rebel groups to find out their whereabouts, manpower, and equipment. COD was also used to sow infighting between rebels, which frequently rendered groups useless as they were too busy caring about internal affairs. And finally, they used the destroy part of seek and destroy by sending military expeditions to engage in battle with rebel groups. The Soviet forces were largely aided by the PDPA government and its military, whose leader was replaced by a pro-Soviet Parcham politician, Babrak Karmal. The Afghanistan National Army, however, in itself was largely ineffective. Many soldiers were practically mercenaries who joined for money rather than ideological reasons. This led to high desertion rates and little combat effectiveness. The army situation was not aided by the fact that when they participated, they were almost always left to the brutal infantry work, with Soviets supporting with tanks and air support. 1985 was the bloodiest year of the war, as Soviet manpower in Afghanistan grew to 108,000 in order to support increasing assaults and offenses.
Oh, when will you ever learn? Oh, when will you ever learn?
The decision to withdraw from Afghanistan was made in 1985, and so began the 3-year process of bolstering the Afghanistan army to properly fight the Mujahideen by themselves. The army was bolstered to a total manpower of 302,000 and was reorganized as a carbon copy of the Soviet armed forces. The PDPA resented this decision, believing that the Soviets were abandoning them. This bolstering, however, would not help, as the army suffered from a desertion rate of 32,000 a year. The Soviets began the withdrawal in January of 1987 and finished in February of 1988. During this time, the Soviet military kept performing seek and destroy missions, which served to protect withdrawing forces. The withdrawal coincided with Mikhail Gorbachev's new policy of conflict avoidance, and Soviet forces were also pulled out of Mongolia, Angola, and Kampuchea. Many Soviet vets are ashamed of their involvement in the war, and in most post-Soviet countries do not receive any veteran benefits. The songs that have been playing throughout the video are all written by Soviet soldiers and mostly speak of their desire to return home, the shadowy guerrilla nature of the Mujahideen, and the ever-present Afghanistan mountains. In total, 14,453 Soviet soldiers were killed. Anywhere between 90,000 to 180,000 Mujahideen had died, and 562,000 civilians were killed in the conflict. I would like to thank you all for taking the time to watch my video on the Soviet-Afghanistan War. This video is of course dedicated to all the victims of this war, soldier and civilian alike.